The cameras cut to the chaos outside Britain's migrant hotels. Angry residents stood shoulder to shoulder with protest banners, their voices shaking with rage and frustration. Parents held children close, pensioners shouted about safety, and young workers cried out about fairness. What began as whispers of discontent had now grown into a deafening storm that no politician could ignore. And right in the middle of this firestorm stood Sir Keir Starmer, the man who had promised leadership but instead found himself at the center of public fury. And then, as if to pour fuel on this already raging fire, came a thunderous warning from across the Atlantic, from Donald Trump himself. The former US president, known for his blunt and unapologetic words, aimed his sharpest criticism yet directly at Starmer, leaving Britain stunned and Starmer humiliated before a watching world. This was not just a political argument. It was not a polite disagreement over policy. No, this was raw, emotional, and devastating. For millions of ordinary Britons, the migrant hotel scandal had become the symbol of everything wrong with their government: secrecy, arrogance, and total disregard for the people who actually live in these communities. Towns across Britain were being transformed overnight as hotels filled with migrants, while locals, who paid their taxes faithfully and struggled through inflation, were ignored. The outrage was visceral. Families who had lived in the same neighborhoods for generations suddenly felt like strangers in their own streets. And all the while, Starmer insisted that everything was under control, even as tensions boiled over. But then came Trump's voice, a voice impossible to ignore. He declared in front of cameras that leaders who ignored their own people had no right to govern, and he specifically called out Starmer. His words rang like a final warning, not just to Starmer, but to the entire political establishment in Britain. For many Britons watching, Trump's message felt like the words they had been screaming into the void, finally echoed on the global stage. And while some dismissed Trump's intervention as foreign meddling, others saw it as the spotlight Britain's political elite had been desperate to avoid. To understand the scale of this crisis, you must step into the shoes of the people living in towns where these hotels stand. Imagine working long hours to barely afford rent or a mortgage, only to watch your local services stretched beyond breaking point. Hospitals, already under strain, suddenly faced surging demand. Schools struggled to provide enough places. And yet, while locals waited months for support, resources appeared overnight for those arriving in these hotels. For ordinary families, it felt like betrayal. This wasn't about compassion or cruelty, it was about fairness, about whether leaders truly cared for their own citizens first. And in the eyes of many, Starmer had failed this most basic test of leadership. The scandal escalated when investigative journalists revealed the staggering cost to taxpayers, billions being funneled into hotel contracts, with some companies profiting enormously while communities suffered. The public demanded answers. Who signed these deals? Why were locals never consulted? Why was there secrecy surrounding contracts worth millions? As the questions mounted, Starmer's explanations grew thinner, his words sounding like rehearsed lines rather than genuine answers. People were not just angry, they were insulted, as though their intelligence had been mocked by polished speeches and empty reassurances. It was in this climate of fury that Trump's words landed like a thunderbolt. He warned that ignoring the voices of the people would lead to consequences no leader could withstand. He painted Starmer as weak, out of touch, and incapable of protecting his nation. Whether you loved Trump or loathed him, his warning carried weight because it resonated with the very heart of the crisis. Millions of Britons felt abandoned, silenced, and betrayed, and now they saw an international figure declaring openly what their own leaders would not. Starmer's allies rushed to defend him, dismissing Trump's comments as interference, but the damage was already done. Headlines blared across Britain and beyond. Trump slams Starmer over migrant hotels. Talk shows buzzed with debate, and social media erupted with fiery arguments. For Starmer, this was more than a political challenge, it was a public humiliation. A man who had built his image on control and authority now looked defensive, cornered, and shaken. And in politics, perception is everything. The public saw weakness, and weakness invites collapse. The migrant hotel outrage was no longer just a domestic issue, it was now international news. And in Britain's pubs, cafes, and living rooms, ordinary people asked the same question. If their own Prime Minister would not listen to them, maybe he would listen to Trump's warning. That thought alone was devastating for Starmer, who prided himself on projecting strength on the world stage. Instead, he now appeared small, diminished,